Economic tensions linked to the US-Iran conflict are increasingly being felt across Africa as disruptions in international energy markets and shipping routes push up the cost of trade. Now, these external shocks come to the backdrop, or at the backdrop, rather, of Africa seeking to deepen economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Area, an agreement aimed at boosting intra-African trade and also reducing the cost of doing business across various borders. How then Africa can use the AfCFTA to turn these disruptions into an opportunity to strengthen trade resilience and build greater economic independence across the continent. Well, to help us answer some of these questions, we're now joined by Dr. Tsotetsi Makong, Director of Coordination and Programs at the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. A very good afternoon, or evening to you rather, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time. So this conflict is, clearly a crisis for African economies, if I can put it that way. But it's also the kind of shock that forces long overdue economic transformations, as various analysts that we've been engaging with are saying. How do you read this particular conflict, impacting on those African economies particularly?
No, thank you very much for having me. And indeed, quite a timely discussion around the continent and the external shocks. And it's not the first time that we are having a discussion around how the continent is always at the tail end of the crises that do take place across the world. We can go back as far as 2008, financial and economic crisis, the food prices crisis, all of that. And again, we are back to the same position, albeit now it's in the context of the conflicts happening elsewhere. We had the same similar issues around COVID. We had similar issues around the Ukraine, as well as a Russia crisis there. And again, again, as I said, we find ourselves in the same position. I think the message is very clear. The continent would need, as over agency, to pull itself with its own bootstraps. And the question is, what are these bootstraps? And of course, we have the AfCFTA in our hands as one of the tools that the continent can use to be able to pull itself outside of this crisis. Is this something that can happen today? It's very early on in the implementation of the AfCFTA, but surely it is one of the tools we only have, probably amongst many, but maybe the main tool we have that can change the fortunes of the continent and drive the continent towards some level, some modicum of economic sovereignty. It should be something that is in our sights to be able to determine our own economic destiny in the continent.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that analogy of bootstraps, but perhaps let me pose this. When we look at some of the impacts, we've been speaking, of course, around how this is also affecting aviation across the board, including in the African continent itself. But when we delve deeper in terms of the immediate pain that this conflict is having, particularly on small businesses, as we understand it. We're hearing, of course, that there are warnings of this looming credit crunch for SMEs, particularly within, the coming weeks. I mean, how severe could this get, especially for those small exporters? We know, of course, that, for instance, on the agricultural output point of view, there's already concerns there.
It's going to be quite a painful one, whether you talk about the cost of transport, you talk about, because energy is in everything, is a lifeblood of everything that we do. So again, all of these different pain points, like I said, even the access to finance, it's not going to be cheap finance. Everything is going to go high for the medium and small and medium enterprises. If you take, for example, already, we have the bulk majority of our people that are actually in the segment of the small businesses. Already they're outside the formal businesses, and already the loans that they're getting, if you look into East Africa, for example, it could be an upward of over 80% of the principal. So already this is just going to add insult to injury, if one was to put it that way. And again, for me, I look at this as let's say a half full glass, as if I may use that particular analogy, because we should be able to take this experience, of course, this incoming pain and the continuing pain coming from this oil crisis, and say to ourselves as a continent, what is it that we can do now? And this being something that can take the pain of our people. And certainly what we see as one of the key areas where we can concentrate on is in areas such as payments. And we do have the legal instruments within the AfCFTA to really make sure that we reduce the cost of finance, again, for the bigger business, but most importantly, for the smaller businesses. So we do have these instruments, and I think the orientation, in my view, should move in that particular direction to say, what do we have right now? And I think we do have the tools.
Yeah. And just on that point, I mean, you mentioned, what kind of bootstraps we actually need to, to get out or circumvent this current dilemma that we are finding ourselves in. We always, posed with that question as the African continent in terms of when will we rise to the occasion? I mean, we've had several calamities, if I can call it that, including COVID-19 as an example. But could this a current conflict, could this finally be the moment where the African continent free trade area moves from just being this ambitious, a move to more a sense of urgency, and we start looking inwards and actually start implementing in some of those strategies that have already been identified?
Absolutely. In fact, if I may give you an example, you take one of the biggest economies in the continent, Nigeria, with the incoming of the AfCFTA. Of course, there are other regional arrangements through which Nigeria trades. Nigeria is now trading more with Africa than it does with the third countries. And that means if we are in this position right now we find ourselves in, there is still actually some bright spots that are beginning to bear fruit to say it is actually possible for us to ring fence, and not only to ring fence the regulatory framework, but actually to make it more conducive for business. And this is what is happening in West Africa, and the AfCFTA is coming in to make it more continental. So what we are seeing, in fact, within the context of the AfCFTA, we had an initiative called Guided Trade Initiative, where we tried to test whether the AfCFTA works. And indeed, we have proven right that indeed the AfCFTA can actually work. We saw goods that were traded from Kenya coming into Ghana, for example, which is normally a very difficult issue to have different regions trading with each other. But today, we have that particular possibility using these particular instruments. And again, our heads of states and government said, and they said, we in fact need to make sure that the AfCFTA, by 2030, everything in terms of the liberalization framework, we have finished in terms of ensuring that all the instruments, negotiation-wise, trade is actually happening. It is already happening already. So the question is, how do we then push this even further? And again, making use of this crisis as the fuel to take these decisions.
And I think the question there is, or the statement is, with urgency. But thank you so much, Dr. Makong. That's all the time we have this evening, I'm afraid, but really do appreciate some of your insights. That was, of course, Dr. Tsotetsi Makong, Director of Coordination and Programs at the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. All right, it's now 18:32. It's time for your market indicators as well as your business of sport.